So, welcome back to the second half of the fourth session. I hope you enjoyed the first half, and most importantly, I hope you've begun to get a sense of the newness breaking out in the prophecies of Isaiah as we move from chapter 39 to chapter 40. And I hope I've also helped you to understand that Isaiah is speaking to a people of the future, prophetically. And once you get an idea of this, sense of his future audience, a lot of the scriptures, very famous scriptures, often quoted scriptures in Isaiah begin to make sense. For example, have a little look down at Isaiah 40, again, verses 27 to 28. And there we read, "Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord? My cause is disregarded by my God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth." And Isaiah is speaking to the remnants. He's speaking to the survivors. Very, very few people were left in the land after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. And here Isaiah seems to be speaking to those who were taken away into exile. People like Daniel, people like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, people like Ezekiel, people that are far off, and no doubt longing to be restored to their lands. And in true Isaiah style, he is recording this far off conversation, this distant conversation, where the people in exile are basically saying, my way is hidden from God, my cause is disregarded by my God. He's forgotten us. That's what the exiles seem to be saying. And Isaiah, in this passage, he's reminding this future generation that they are dealing with God. They are dealing with a God of truth and a God of promise, and he hasn't forgotten his people. And despite all that's happened, despite all the destruction and the death and the exile, God is coming to save his people, and he's going to bring his people home. And it's this plan really that concerns the next few chapters of Isaiah, and we're just going to have a very brief look through these chapters up to Isaiah 49. What we'll begin to see is that this plan of God, this new plan that he's hatching for his people, is detailed in these chapters. I mean, just have a look with me at Isaiah 41, and you'll begin to see the beginnings of what God is planning for his people after this destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 1 of chapter 41, it says this: "Be silent before me, you islands, let the nations renew their strength. Let them come forward and speak, let us meet together at the place of judgment. Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? He hands nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. He pursues them and moves on unscathed by a path his feet have not travelled before. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them, I am he." And what this passage is telling us, very interestingly, is that God is going to send someone, and he says they're from the east, and they're being called to some sort of military action, and it references nations being handed over to this person from the east, and that kings themselves will be subdued before this person from the east, and they'll be reduced to dust and wind-blown chaff. And we had this character coming from the east, Isaiah is telling us, not named at this point. And there's also this sort of inference that there is another person involved in this new plan of God to rescue his people. And in verse 25 it says, "I have stirred up one from the north, and he comes, one from the rising sun who calls on my name. He treads on rulers as if they were mortar, as if he were a potter treading the clay." And in fact, probably both of these coming kings are being referenced here, because he talks about one coming from the north, and he talks about one coming from the rising sun, which is the east. And in relation to this king from the north, first of all, it's interesting because it uses this word stirring up to describe the king of the north. And in fact, way back in Isaiah 13, we'd already met or come across a very similar phrase used in relation to the Medes, who were basically, they came from northern Iran, and they were the ones who are described as coming to destroy Babylon in 539 BC. And I mentioned in Daniel. In Isaiah 13 verses 17 to 18 it says this: "See, I will stir up against them the Medes, who do not care for silver, who have no delight in gold." And Isaiah 13, if you remember, is dedicated to the destruction of Babylon. And here we are being told, way back in Isaiah 13, that the ones who will bring destruction to Babylon will be the Medes. And so I think looking back at this passage in Isaiah 41, it's talking about a power coming from the north, the Medes, and it's talking about a power coming from the east. And it's this power from the east that's particularly interesting, because the second power to be involved in the destruction of Babylon were the Persians. And of course the Medes and the Persians famously, biblically, were in coalition against the Babylonians. And you'll probably remember the reference to the laws of the Medes and the Persians. And it's complex, but I believe there was really a coalition between these two powers. So who is this power from the east that Isaiah is prophesying, who will be a key player in the rescuing of his people and the destruction of Babylon? And the destruction of Babylon is important because, of course, the Babylonians were the ones holding the Jewish people captive. They'd taken them into exile, they destroyed their holy city, they destroyed their temple, and now the Jewish people were living in Babylon, and they needed a redeemer. They needed someone to come and to rescue them and to take them home. And of course this is so prophetic and messianic and eschatological, speaking of the end times and the coming of God to rescue his people and to bring them home. But look for a second back in Isaiah 45, or forward into Isaiah 45, we find out a little bit more about this king from the east. It says this, verse 1. "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their armour, to open doors before him so that the gates will not shut. I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down the gates of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name for the sake of my servant Jacob. Of Israel my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honour, though you do not acknowledge me." And this king being referred to, this coming king, is actually named as Cyrus, which in the Hebrew is Koresh. One of the most famous kings of the ancient world is being named 150 years before his rise to power. And more surprisingly, and not just, it's surprising first of all that he's named, but it's also surprising how Isaiah refers to him, which is as his anointed one, Limeshahau, which is a word from connected with Ham-Shiach, which is the Messiah, Yeshua Ham-Shiach, Jesus the Messiah. And so Cyrus is being described as the anointed one of God, who's got this divine commission to come and to rescue, not to come and destroy, but to come and rescue. It's what happened. Darius leading the Medes and Cyrus leading the Persians come to Babylon in 539, and they destroy the Babylonians. The famous feast of Belshazzar, when Belshazzar sees the writing on the wall, mene tekel parsin, he sees the end of his throne, and we're told that the Medes arrive and the Persians arrive, and Darius sits on the throne, and then Cyrus sits on the throne. These events are all reported in the book of Daniel. Prophesied all this time in advance, very cryptically at this point, but nonetheless clearly. And so what I'm trying to get you to see here is that just as Sennacherib prefigures this sort of anti-Messiah, here Cyrus, this king from the east, is prefiguring the Messiah and the coming of Christ, the Anointed One. And it's just is a shock and surprise that God has chosen a Gentile king and called him his anointed to be the one, the agent, if you like, of rescue for God's people. It goes further. The sort of the revelation and the surprise goes further. And we look back in Isaiah 44, we're told a little bit more about Cyrus. Again, all these years in advance. It says this. Go down to verse 26, speaking of the Lord's words to Jerusalem, who says of Jerusalem, it shall be inhabited, of the towns of Judah they shall be rebuilt, and of their ruins I will restore them. Who says of the watery deep, be dry, and I will dry up your streams. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and I will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. So like, get this, he is calling, Isaiah is referring to Cyrus as his shepherd. In the Hebrew is Roy, and that he is going to be the one who will tell the remnant that they're the ones in exile, when they're freed from the power of the Babylonians, that they're free to go home, that they're free to rebuild their cities, that they're free to rebuild their holy city and their temple. That's quite incredible. And of course that's exactly what happened. Cyrus comes to Babylon, he releases the Jewish people, he gives them permission to go back. There's the famous declaration known as the Cyrus Cylinder, which is, you can go and see it in the British Museum. It tells of this decree that went out throughout the land, allowing people to return to their homelands. And of course that's the beginning of this next major episode of biblical history, where the Jewish people go back to their land under people like Ezra and Nehemiah. They rebuild the second temple, and the prophets like Haggai and Zechariah, they're all part of this second temple period that brings us to eventually to the end of the book of Malachi and the end of the Old Testament. And so Cyrus is the one, he's the agent of bringing about this change. He's the agent of God to destroy the Babylonians and to rescue God's people. And you can read about that. You can read about it in 2 Chronicles 36. And at the beginning of Ezra, we have the very words of Cyrus. The very decree of Cyrus is detailed there. So this is important apocalyptically, and it's also important messianically, and it's important historically. These are great historical moments that are being referenced by Isaiah before they even happened. So that brings us to Isaiah 46 and 47. Suddenly the placing of these two chapters here makes perfect sense, because remember, Isaiah is, although he's speaking about the coming rescue of the Jewish people in exile, he's also speaking before these things have actually happened. And Isaiah 46 and 47 are prophecies directed against Babylon, and speak of the fall of Babylon. And it's, if you like, again, the apocalyptically, this is so powerful. I mean, if you look at the book of Revelation, it's the fall of Babylon that takes place before Christ comes, or as Christ comes. And so these events all point forward to end time events. And this is what happened. This is actually what happened in 539 BC. Babylon actually did fall, and the Jewish people began to go home. But in these chapters, it's so fascinating because we have some really interesting facts about the fall of Babylon, and this really obscure passage in Isaiah 46 verses 1 to 2, which demands a little bit of explanation. Let me just read it. Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low, their idols are borne by beasts of burden. The images that are carried about are burdensome, a burden for the weary. They stoop and bow down together, unable to rescue the burden. They themselves go off into captivity. And I wondered about this passage for years. It always struck me as such a strange passage, and I never understood why on earth would it appear when it did in the book of Isaiah. But once you get the historical backdrop, that this is speaking about the moment that God's people are going to be set free, it suddenly begins to make sense. And in fact, these two references to Bel and to Nebo were references to Babylonian gods. Bel was probably a reference to Marduk, which is he was the main Babylonian god that was the most common god and who lived in Babylon. And then there was this other god called Nebo, who was the god Nabu, who lived probably in the nearby city of Borsippa, which was Nimrod. And they were like worshipped, like really importantly. They were really important gods for the Babylonians. And in fact, interestingly, Nebuchadnezzar, he's actually named after Nabu. His name means Nabu, preserve my firstborn son. And in fact, just purely incidentally, trivia for you, the son of Nebuchadnezzar was Awel Marduk, or evil Merodach, as he's referred to in the Bible in 2 Kings 25:27. You can look that up, which means the servant of Marduk. So it's just interesting that Nebuchadnezzar is named after Nebu, and Awel Marduk is named after Marduk. And this passage I love this passage because it's a really interesting presentation of what happens to these Babylonian gods. And what's being referenced here is the tradition. Isaiah is referencing this tradition of the gods of Babylon being paraded out of the city of Babylon every year. They would do it in the new year. They would take the god Marduk, they would process him out of the city, and then they would process him back into the city through the famous Ishtar Gate that you may have heard of. And similarly, they would go and get the other god, Nebo. They'd get him from Borsippa, nearby city, and he would bring him into Babylon and then take him out again. And it's like the idea being presented by Isaiah here is of these beasts of burden carrying these gods on their back, and they just can't carry the weight of these gods, and they're falling down in the street, these beasts of burden, and they're being used by Isaiah to speak of the plight and the destiny of the Babylonians, which is to go into captivity. Because what used to happen when the city went into captivity, the captors would not just take the people exile, they would take the gods exile of that people, and it was seen as like a triumph over the people, a triumph over their gods, and those gods would be taken and put in the temple of the victors. And that's exactly what happened with the Israelites and with the people of Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Jerusalem. They took all the treasures from the temple and they took them back to to Babylon. And it was a sign of ultimate victory to take people captive and take their gods captive. And this is a picture of the gods of Babylon being taken captive and of the people themselves being taken captive. And even more interestingly and excitingly, there's also a lot of irony and sort of mockery going on in Isaiah's words, because he's describing the gods of Babylon as being on the backs of beasts and being carried around. And in contrast, he refers to Yahweh, who says, I have upheld you since birth and have carried you since you were born. And even to your old grey hairs, I am he who will sustain you, and I've made you, and I will carry you. It's Isaiah making fun of the gods of Babylon and the people of Babylon who made their own gods and carried them around on donkeys. And here he's saying that God he's not made, he's not carried around. Indeed, he's the one who made us, and he's the one who carries us. That's what Isaiah seems to say. It's also interesting in Isaiah 46 verse 11, there's a little verse hidden away there which says, from the east I will summon a bird of prey, from a far off land a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that I will bring about. What I've planned, that I will do. And in fact, it's just a little thing there hidden away. This reveals the one who's going to come and destroy Babylon, who we've already met, Cyrus. And here it refers to Cyrus as a bird of prey. And it's so interesting because Cyrus, we know this from history, he had a standard, the battle standard of Cyrus was a Shabaz, which was an eagle. And you can see this in the slide. And it's just, for me, it's so fascinating that this, again, thinking of the prophetic distance between the words of Isaiah and the events that he spoke of, that it's actually referencing the standard of the man who would come and destroy Babylon. That's just, I thought, an interesting point. The other thing we see in this section, Isaiah 47, is it goes on to continue with this idea of the Babylonians themselves going into captivity, and indeed the very destruction of Babylon. We need to say something about this, because the actual destruction of Babylon, what's described in Daniel, doesn't read like the total destruction of Babylon. In fact, Babylon wasn't destroyed absolutely in this moment, but certainly there was an invasion, there was an attack, there was death, and there was a fight. There were battles before the fall of Babylon, but historically it's quite blurry what actually happened and who did what. Were the Medes there? Weren't they there? And so on. And it's a matter of great debate and interest. But all I was going to say was that this image of the destruction of Babylon takes on a deeper prophetic significance. It's not just about the destruction of Babylon in 539. In fact, the city went on for a few hundred years carried on to be quite an important city in the ancient world. But of course now it is literally just ruins now. There are just ruins there. So the destruction, it's talking about something bigger than the actual historical event. And of course the placement of Babylon in Revelation makes us understand that it's talking about a bigger sense of a symbol and a metaphor of wickedness. But here we seem to have this description of the people of Babylon going into exile. And in Isaiah 47 it says, Go down, sit in the dust, virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, queen city of the Babylonians. No longer will you be called tender or delicate. Take millstones and grind flour. Take off your veil. Lift up your skirts, bare your legs, wade through the streams. Your nakedness will be exposed, and so on. And it's a picture of a woman, and the woman is sitting down. She's sitting it's like she's sitting down in the dust after defeat and destruction, and the idea of her wading across the streams, it's a picture of her going into exile. And it's an image very similarly used of Jerusalem going down into the dust. And really the fault of Babylonian, it's interesting because in the same chapter it explains the fault of the Babylonians was that they had a commission from God to destroy, but that they'd gone too far. And it comes out in verse 6, it says, I was angry with my people and desecrated my inheritance. I gave them into your hand, and you showed them no mercy. Even on the aged, you laid a very heavy yoke. And you said, I am forever the eternal queen, but you did not consider these things or reflect what might happen. And so this was a classic fault of the powers that God sort of used as agents of his destruction. I know it's a sort of difficult and unpalatable idea, but that God sometimes uses these nations to punish other nations. But here the Babylonians seem to have not just carried out their divine commission, but just been too brutal or too aggressive or too destructive, that they themselves came under the judgment of God. And that judgment is carried out by Cyrus and by the Medes in 539 BC. So, the last couple of chapters in this little section of the last prophecies of Isaiah that I said we would look at, and I did say we'd go up to chapter 49 in this fourth session. Now I just want to say a few things about these last two chapters. I believe that these are probably some of the most important chapters in the book of Isaiah. They're some of the most mysterious chapters in the book of Isaiah. And they begin by moving focus away from Babylon, even away from the Persians and away from the destruction that they were going to bring, and the focus is brought back onto the people of Israel, or the people of Judah. I mean, again, the language here is interesting because after Isaiah 40, there's a sense, and after the destruction of Jerusalem, in fact, when when we speak of the people of the Jewish people, there's no longer like two kingdoms. There's no longer the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. There's like the Israelites or the Judahites. The terms become a bit more amorphous and synonymous with each other. So when I say Israel in this context, I'm talking about the new Israel that was going to be formed as a result of the return to the land. And again, that in itself, as we'll see, is a prophetic thing, that a new Israel, united Israel, would come from this calamity that they've been through. But at this point in Isaiah 48, there is unfinished business with the Israelites, with the people of Judah. Look at what it says. Listen to this, you descendants of Jacob, you who are called by the name of Israel, you and come from the line of Judah, you who take oaths in the name of the Lord and who invoke the name of the God of Israel, but not in truth or righteousness, you who call yourselves citizens of the holy city and claim to rely on the God of Israel, the Lord Almighty is his name. And it's like Isaiah is prophetically addressing these people of the future, and he's pointing out something really important to them, which is that just because they are the descendants of Jacob, just because they carry the name of Israel, just because they're from the line of Judah, and that's not enough. Ancestry at this point is not enough. And just because they take oaths in the name of the Lord and invoke the name of the God of Israel, these sort of invocations, these invocations are empty, because they're not made in truth or righteousness. And just because they consider themselves citizens of Jerusalem, it's not enough. That God is still not satisfied with his people. God is still not satisfied with their righteousness, and in inverted commas. And it's almost as if this is a turning point in the history of God's dealings with the Jewish people. And it's almost as if God is saying, like, I am now going to do something about this. Like, I've waited long enough, now I am going to do something. I am going to bring about what's necessary for my people to bear the fruit of the kingdom, to be a fruitful vine, and that he himself will work this. And there's an interesting, the whole chapter, and you can read it through, the whole chapter is interesting because God says that in the past, he always used to speak in a certain way to his people. He would speak in plenty of time before an event happened, so that people would know that it was him and not the idols that had revealed something. But now he was saying in 6 and 7, he's saying that he's not going to deal with his people in this way anymore, and he's going to show them something brand new. And Isaiah 48, 6 to 7, read this: "From now on I will tell you new things, of hidden things unknown to you. They are created now, not long ago. You have not heard of them before today, so you cannot say, yes, I knew of them." And it's like in this moment of coming rescue, in this moment of coming destruction of Babylon, that God announces this revelation, something new is coming. From now on I will tell you new things, of hidden things unknown to you. They are created now and not long ago. You have not heard of them before today, so you cannot say, yes, I knew of them. And it's like God is saying, I'm changing the way that I'm speaking to my people. I'm no longer going to give you a lot of notice. I'm telling you now, this is imminent, this is coming, this is the day. And that he is opening a brand new prophetic chapter in the history of his people. And we've already had this sense, this growing newness, right back in Isaiah 40, which we looked at in the last session, that God is proclaiming and announcing something amazing is coming. The King is coming, that his word will not fail. And indeed in Isaiah 43, there's also been this hint of this coming new thing. Forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing, now it springs up, do you not perceive it? Isaiah 43, 18 to 19. And obviously they didn't perceive it at that point, which is why God had to tell them again in Isaiah 48 that he is going to do something new. And I suppose the $1 million question is, and the question is that the thing that you're all wondering, about is, what is this new thing? What is this new thing that God was going to do? And gratefully, although ambiguously and controversially sort of understood at times, the answer does come in Isaiah 49. The great reveal, as I call it, is presented to us, and it's divided scholarly opinion as to who is being referred to in this passage. But I want to just suggest to you that I want to suggest to you an answer, an idea that you can think about for yourselves. But just look at the text quickly. Isaiah 49 says this: "Listen to me, you islands. Hear this, you distant nations. Before I was born, the Lord called me. From my mother's womb he has spoken my name. He made my mouth like a sharpened sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendour. But I said, I have laboured in vain, I have spent my strength for nothing at all. Yet what is due me is in the Lord's hand, and my reward is with me. And now the Lord says, he who formed me in the womb to be a servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and gather Israel to himself. For I am honoured in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has been my strength. He says, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob, and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And so the question is, who is this individual? We have a few options, we have a few ideas or a few potential candidates for this individual. I mean, firstly, Isaiah himself, perhaps he was perhaps in prophetic, there's a very common prophetic motif, perhaps he was called from before his mother's womb, perhaps he understood himself as being called from his mother's womb. Certainly he had a mouth like a sharpened sword, he was a prophet of the Lord, and he was God's servant. And yet there's a sense of despair that creeps in there, that in verse 4, I've laboured in vain, I've spent my strength for nothing at all. And it just doesn't quite fit with the person of Isaiah. And similarly, it could be Cyrus. I mean, Cyrus was definitely called before he was born. Isaiah spoke of him 100 or so years in advance. And he certainly could be described as having a mouth like a sharpened sword. He was a king and he was a military man. Or perhaps the Messiah himself. And yet, would the Messiah say, I've laboured in vain? I don't think so. And in fact, the answer to the puzzle is, I think, in verse 3, very plainly stated. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendour. And I think what's happening in this passage is that we're being introduced to the new thing that God is about to do, that God is about to bring about a totally new way of seeing Israel. And in fact, I wonder whether the idea of I've laboured in vain, I've spent my strength for nothing at all, it's reminiscent of Jacob and his wrestling with God and his failure to overcome God, and he just clinging on to God at the ford of Jabbok, and that moment of weakness also being the moment of transformation. The moment of defeat was the moment of when he gets a new name and he gets a blessing from God. And I think it sort of prefigures this moment that Isaiah is speaking of, that Israel is going to be made new, that in the moment of desolation, in the midst of desolation and destruction, will come forth a new Israel. That is God's doing, that is brought about by God's actions. And it's like there is this, suddenly makes sense of this sort of tension that we see a lot of in Isaiah between this condemnation of Israel and the glorification of Israel. And we've seen that already in Isaiah 48. He's telling Israel off, and yet here we're being given something, being given an image of Israel as being for the display of God's splendour. So it's, for me, it's like the climax of what Isaiah is about. It's the climactic message of the book of Isaiah, and everything that follows will centre in and around this idea of a glorified Israel, and that the punchline or the headline is that Israel will experience rebirth, And this rebirth is a spiritual rebirth, and this new Israel will be a spiritual Israel. And this new spiritual Israel will be an Israel into which the nations of the world are grafted, and is a vision and a picture of the ecclesia of God, the people of God, of the future, of which we are now a part, who have been made new by the Spirit through the actions of a servant. And we're sort of left with this, in Isaiah 49, we're left with mention of this servant, who it says was despised and abhorred by the nation, to the servant of rulers. And I love that, he was the servant of rulers. And this is the wonderful news, and this is the messianic hope that this Messiah will come, and through his suffering, through his servanthood, he will bring about a new Israel. That's Isaiah's message, and next time we're going to be looking at Isaiah 50 onwards, and looking at the servant songs, and looking at the description of this. The Messiah was totally unexpected. No one expected the Messiah to suffer, and yet here it is revealed that if there's going to be newness, then it has to come through the death of God's servant, God's Messiah, the Anointed One. So we've got that to look forward to next time. Thanks for listening.